how to brew beer. I don't know if have any of you ever made beer before, been part of making beer before? Yep, excellent. So beer is a pretty simple thing, actually, overall. It is made up of 4 ingredients, or at least it needs to be made up of 4 ingredients. Does anyone know what those are?
One is hops.
Okay, hops is one of them.
Water. Yeast.
I heard water and yeast. Okay, and we're missing one more.
Is there a malt in there?
There's malt in there. So, of the 4 ingredients, they all serve a purpose, and they're all needed in order to make beer. The first one is malt. Malt is by far the most important. If you have malt, you basically can make beer regardless of what else you have. I mean, you need yeast and water too, but malt is the source of the sugar in brewing. It also is the source of a lot of the flavors. So, malt is basically barley, traditionally. Barley is a simple grain, a cereal grain, and it's used in a ton of different things you'll eat. It provides starch. So when malt as a grain basically makes seeds. The seeds themselves contain starch, which becomes sugar. Starch is what you'd eat if you eat a cereal or anything like that. That's what's providing you all the carbohydrate and all the energy. So malt provides that as well as a bunch of the flavor. It can be handled a couple different ways, and those give you the flavor you're looking for. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of what malt is. Here are 2 examples to start. They're both grain. You can hold these and pass them around if you want. And you can open them and smell them and taste them even if you want. They're good to eat and all that. Basically, there's 2 types there. The lighter colored malt there, which both are barley, is lightly kilned to dry it. So what they do is they wet it and sprout it. That's called the malting process. And that converts all the starch to sugar. And then they kiln it. They heat it. In the first one, the lighter colored one, that's pale malt. That's only really dry. And it provides most of the sugar when you brew. The other one that's there is called chocolate malt. That one was toasted, like you would when you roast coffee. And that provides the flavors like chocolate or roast or what you'd see in a stout. There's another type that's in there that's called crystal malt, where they actually heat it when it's wet and it caramelizes. So that creates the sweet and caramely flavors you'll often taste in a beer. Those 3 basic types together can provide almost any of the basic malt backbone that's used in the brewing process. When you're brewing beer at home, there's a way to skip a large portion of the process, and I'll explain it a little bit later, and I'll explain what that is. So the next thing that goes into your beer is hops. These are hops as often used by brewers. So hops is the flower of a vine, which basically can grow about 20 feet tall in a season pretty easily and makes these cone-like flowers. Most brewers have them dried and then ground up and pressed into pellets where they're stored because they're more efficient to store and more efficient to use. Otherwise, they look like a flower. The plant makes a resin called lupulin, which basically adds bitterness as well as aroma to beer. So if you smell what I passed around, you'll smell that it's got kind of a citrusy or might be described as dank or floral or skunky aroma. That is provided by all of the different oils that are involved and are in the plant. It's the only other plant in its family is actually cannabis. So a lot of the flavors and the oils and the things like that that are added are very similar in compounds to what's in that, but they are not in any way hallucinogenic, though they do affect your body. Some are used for sleep and things like that, actually. If you smell them, they're supposed to make you tired. So people make pillows and stuff out of them. The other 2 things that are involved in the brewing process are yeast and water. Yeast is what actually turns the sugar into alcohol. Without that, you really just kind of have sugar water. And that is what makes all the alcohol basically on the planet. So anything that is alcoholic, whether it's wine, whether it's mead, even your bread, before you bake the dough, has alcohol in it. So anything that has yeast will make carbon dioxide and alcohol from sugar and water. Then you have water. Water is obviously key. Mostly it just dilutes what you have and is a carrier for it. It also adds a lot of flavor to the brewing process and has guided a lot of what brewing is in the past. And I'll explain that a little bit in a minute just to kind of get you in there. So the history of beer. Some people say that beer is the oldest fermented beverage, the oldest alcoholic beverage. Others say that that's mead, which is honey mixed with water and yeast. But beer's basically been brewed for about 10,000 years. There are clear signs of it basically having been brewed about 3,000 years ago, where there's actually traces of the beer left and all those kinds of things. It didn't become, however, what we look at it now as until about 1,000 years ago, till about 1000 AD. And then 1500 AD is when it really was established as exactly what you expect it as. That's when hops became used consistently. And that's when in the 1500s in Germany, in Bavaria, they started having what's called the Reinheitsgebot, which was the purity law, and is basically what it translates to. And it meant that you're only allowed to make beer using malt, water, hops, and yeast. Nothing else can go in it, or it's not beer anymore. And that was basically so you wouldn't get ripped off by buying something made with rice or corn or something of that sort, which now is actually fairly commonly used. And that still is actually illegal in that country to use any of those other things. Otherwise, you can't call it beer. The ingredients available in an area started to develop what are the different styles. The water, the grain that was available. So in places like Burton-on-Trent in England, the very hard water, it has tons of salt and mineral and things like that in it, led to brewing styles that work really well with that, like stouts. So there's tons of breweries that make stouts and dark beers. The heavy water complemented it. If you make, for example, a hoppy bright beer with that water, it comes out as like just wrong. It doesn't taste right. It tastes off. So places with very dry water started doing that and making basically beers that are bright and hoppy. Like your Pilsners come from the Czech Republic, where the water has almost nothing in it. So that's kind of a little bit of a guide to basically what goes into your beer. Now, how do you actually brew beer? You said you brewed beer before. Do you remember the process at all?
Yeah, it was a Belgian ale. Yeah, my friend had the equipment, so we do the old school. Start with the bucket. And we add everything in. Come back to it a few weeks later once the sugar started eating it. And then all the way to the end, and we're bottling. One at a time. So it was pretty much as primitive as it gets, sort of the start to finish.
Most definitely. So if you actually want to brew beer at home, which hopefully you do, because it's fun and it makes cheap beer, and then you get to drink it. And the same kind of goes for any of your alcohols, and I can kind of explain how that converts over to anything else you might want to make, whether it be wine or mead or what have you. But basically, you are making sugar water. Yeast is then turning that sugar water into beer with alcohol in it. So I don't consider myself someone that makes beer. I make sugar water. And that's kind of the key to the process. So if you wanted to make beer at home, the key is to take your malt, which I passed around, and to start to mix it with water so that it sits at about 150 degrees for an hour. Now, when you do that, the starch in all that grain converts to simple sugar, which the yeast can now eat. Until that part, if you just mix grain and water for a minute and then pour that out, yeast can't eat it. It'll just leave you with some basically starchy water, which you don't really want. Looks like you're trying to make pasta or something like that, basically. Now, what you do is you let it sit together at that temperature, converts all the starch to sugar, and then you pull that water out. Traditionally, say 10,000 years ago, basically just by pouring some grain into some water and leaving it for a week, it'll do all this on its own. It'll make alcohol because the grain will start to convert and become sugar, and yeast will fall into it and get in from the air and eat all that. Today, we do it a little more in a more controlled way. Ever since the 1700s, when early 1800s, where Louis Pasteur invented essentially single cell culturing so that we could keep a single cell in. But anyway, you basically take that sugar water, you run it out into another pot, then you boil it. And during that time, you add hops. Now, the reason hops are partially used is because they actually keep away bacteria and other foreign things from eating that wort, that sugar water. So what you do is you boil it, you add hops or any other spices you might be adding back in the day, and then you cool it down. So as you've cooled it down, you're going to, once it reaches about room temp like this, you would add yeast. And I'll show you now, if you wanted to do it at home, what I'd recommend to start is you take a big kettle with water and you use this. You can open that up. That is dry malt extract. So what they do for home brewing and for your convenience is they take grain, they basically put it through the process where they mash it, and that's where they mix it with the water and convert the starch to sugar. And then they take it and they basically spray it really hot on the side of this big stainless steel thing. And it dries it out almost instantly. And you're left with that powder. If you take that powder and mix it with water, you get basically wort. You get sugar water. And so that means that you can basically just heat a pot of water on the stove, pour that in the right amount, and go ahead and start basically adding hops to your beer. You've just taken, 3-4 hours out of your brewing process, basically, especially if you're doing it at home. So you're going to take that, make sugar water, add your hops, and then you're going to cool it down. There's a lot of ways to do it. In professional brewing, you have what's called a heat exchanger, where you essentially use cold water in order running through either basically metal in order to cool the beer down quickly. So at a professional brewery, they'll have that done in half an hour, 10 minutes, what have you. At home, what you'll often do is take it and pour it out to mix with cold water. So you'll basically take really cold, sanitized water, like Arrowhead water from a jug, have it almost ice cold, make a couple gallons of hot wort, and then just mix it with the super cold, and it'll be the right temperature. So that's kind of how you do that at home without any equipment. Otherwise, you buy a chiller, a heat exchanger. So once you've done that, you're going to add yeast. So right here I have, and it's kind of fermenting, this is some wort that was made on Tuesday. You can pass it around. You can smell it if you want. This is actually a wild fermentation, a mixed fermentation, which means it has a number of different kinds of yeast and actually bacteria in it. It's a traditional way of making beer, and it's what you would have gotten a few hundred years ago if you tried to brew. It is actively fermenting, so that's about halfway to being beer. Right now it's yeasty and got all kinds of, it basically has a few billion cells of living stuff in that little bit. Now once it sits for another week, it'll actually be ready to drink. All that'll drop out and it'll be clarified, and then we can pull that off and have actual essential beer to drink. Now you'll notice it's fizzing. The two things that the yeast makes when you put it in there, well, it makes a lot of things, but the two main things it makes is it makes CO2, carbon dioxide, and it makes alcohol. So right now that's going to be somewhat alcoholic, and all the fizzing is carbon dioxide coming out. When you want to bottle it, if say I capped that right now and didn't open it, it would start to carbonate. It would start to become fizzy, more and more so. If I did it right now, that glass would probably explode in a couple hours from the pressure. But that's how they get carbonated beer in bottles. Once you've fermented the beer out and you let most of the yeast come out, you basically put it in a container with a little bit of extra sugar and cap it. And that makes the right amount of carbonation, if you do it right, so that it's fizzy in the bottle. And that's called naturally carbonating. A big brewery these days, or even you at home, can take that and basically take a tank of CO2 and just shove the CO2 in using like a little stone, air stone like you'd have in a fish tank. And so that process is done in 20 minutes rather than a week like you'd need to leave a bottle normally. But that's basically the beer making process, very simplified. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's see, what do I have? Then there's the drinking part. So once you have that made, you drink it, and it's pretty awesome. It can get you intoxicated, it tastes good, it can be refreshing. That's probably the best part, really.
I have a question. So can you talk a little about ales versus lagers and kind of, I guess, why in New Hampshire there's so many of ales but not many lagers? Okay,
so there's two different main species. They can mate, but they mostly don't, of brewer's yeast. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the species. And the two types ferment a little bit differently. And there's even a little bit of crossover. And basically what it is that lager yeasts ferment on the bottom of the tank. And they take a lot longer. Lagers are beers like all the big scale macro beers that you'd think of. Budweiser, PBR, Miller, Heineken, those are all lagers. They are dry, crisp, generally, and they take a while to make. So it takes a couple months, at least a month, to make a lager. Because it's at colder temperatures, it ferments way slower. It also makes less flavor. So the reason that, there's a couple reasons you don't see it that commonly. Most of the beer made in the state is lager. So Budweiser is, we have Budweiser down in Merrimack, so they make, more beer than anyone else. Hence, but it takes a while. So you have to have huge tanks and a good process. They're also not very forgiving. So as a beginning brewer or as a startup company, if you try to make basically a Budweiser, if you have even the tiniest flaw in your process, you can taste the mistake. Whereas if I make an ale, and I'll explain those, you have a little more forgiveness. Ales are different than their brethren from lagers in that they ferment on the top. So the yeast is in solution, and then there's a big layer of it that'll usually kind of cover the top. And they ferment a lot faster and at warmer temperatures. So whereas where a lager will ferment down at, say, 40 degrees, a ale will ferment at 60 to 70 degrees. It'll also make a lot more flavor, more esters, which will taste kind of fruity, and maybe like the banana in a Belgian ale, or phenols, which are like the cloviness in a Belgian ale, and a whole bunch of other flavors like that. The reason you see mostly those is most of the craft beer styles are focused on that. So IPA stands for India Pale Ale. You'll have a red ale, a brown ale, all those things are ales. They ferment out really quickly. It can easily be 1 week from starting a brew to packaging into bottles and being able to send it out for a lot of them. So they're very quick to make, and they're a little more forgiving because you tend to have more hops and more flavors made. It'll cover up small defects in your brewing process. So that's the main reason you mostly see those. Any other questions about the process or anything about beer? Yes?
What kind of filtration process is used, or is there one?
It depends. So at a larger brewery, there's definitely a filtration process. And there's a couple different kinds. They have basically filter presses are very common, where essentially there's pads with very small holes in them, and they'll run it through from one side to the other, and that'll filter out all the particulate. Commonly used now amongst craft brewers is what's called a centrifuge. It's basically this big thing that spins at 10,000 RPM super fast, and it means that all of the stuff that's in it that isn't beer gets pulled off to the side and separated out, and that sends a clean beer through. Many beers aren't filtered, and those are essentially unfiltered ales. You'll see them, they'll still be at least a little bit cloudy most of the time. Filtering has its upsides in that it's good for shelf stability and can basically make a very crystal clear beer quickly. The downside is it does pull flavor and aroma out. So if you're making a really flavorful beer and you filter it, you're gonna have a less flavorful beer basically. But otherwise, it's not dangerous to drink anything. I mean, you can drink what's fermenting on the table right now. It won't hurt you at all. I might not. It probably won't taste very good at this point, but you can.
What a Guinness, it's a heavier beer, so is there a ratio that's different when you make like a heavy beer?
So there is. So when you mash, you can basically control how heavy the beer is during that process, as well as by your yeast selection. So a heavier beer basically means that it has more stuff left over. So what that means is that a yeast that is, as they call it, attenuative, or can ferment more, will dry the beer out more and make it seem less heavy. Whereas a yeast that can eat less of the sugar will leave more behind and make it feel heavier. You can also control that with the mash temp. If I mix the grain and the water together at a higher temperature, say 160 degrees, it'll make these really long chain sugars that yeast can't eat, and it'll leave it with more body behind. It is. Now there's two reasons a Guinness is heavy. One, they actually carbonate a Guinness halfway, and then they do the rest of it using nitrogen. Now nitrogen can't go into solution in the water, so it basically kind of comes out and sits in there, and basically adds a thickness and a weird kind of body to the beer. And so that's one of the reasons. The other reason with Guinness, and this is kind of a story, is back about 100 years ago, there was an employee there who came up with a product, what he called Guinness flavor extract. It's a coffee-like syrup, basically, with that Guinness flavor in it. And they decided that it was cheaper and more reliable to make that and then have breweries around the world mix it with light lager in order to make the product. So the way they make Guinness is they make a light lager similar to a Bud Light, and this is done at, I think, 18 facilities around the world. They take that and they actually just brew it that way, light lager, and then they blend this syrup with it to make Guinness. And they add carbonation and they add nitrogen and they put it in a bottle for you. So it's kind of how would I describe it? It's kind of similar to using your Keurig machine and versus making coffee. It's kind of instant add your coffee flavor to something. So, but it's an interesting product, and they sure have done a great job at getting it every single place in the world, basically. Yeah, any other thoughts?
How's root beer, like 95 is root beer, that seems really big, you know, all the flavored beer, is that a beer or is that like just an alcoholic drink or?
Oh, so like,
95 is root beer, can you make like root beer, that beer at home that tastes like root beer?
certainly. So root beer traditionally was made using the leftover, basically sugar water from the brewing process. So you'd mix your grain with water once, and you'd run that off, and that's your main beer. And then if you put more water in and do it again, there's still some sugar left. So they'd do it again, and then they'd add roots rather than hops and other herbs and spices to make that. It's a little bit hard to make not your father's root beer at home because they're using really large, essentially when you ferment something, it's hard to stop that. So in order to make something like that, you have to ferment it and then make the yeast stop adding sugar. Otherwise, it won't be sweet when you're finished. So they're actually pasteurizing it and then back sweetening it and force carbonating it with a tank. So it's kind of as much as it seems like a homemade product, I believe it's the same people that make Four Loko that own that. Yes.
I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but what about ciders? What's different about brewing ciders, like hard ciders?
So basically all of the different alcohol making processes are kind of similar. You have to start with sugar. And in that case, your sugar is apple juice. So the only real difference is that you don't have to heat it. You basically just take apple juice and add yeast and leave it for a couple weeks and then put it in a bottle or a container and drink it. So that's basically it. With wine, you take grapes and take the juice out, or leave the skins in, add yeast. When it's fermented and done, you put it in bottles and you drink it. Mead is mix honey and water, add yeast. When it's done, put it in bottles and drink it. So making all alcohol is kind of that same process. There's difference in the choices of yeast you'll use and a little bit in how you'll handle it, but that's about it, really. So once you learn how to make one alcohol, you can basically learn how to make any alcohol you want without a whole bunch of extra effort. Yeah, it's kind of fun. Yeah, any other questions about the process or, anything like that?
What's the limit you can make, like in New Hampshire at home? Is there a limit? Like you can only make a gallon a week?
Technically, I believe there's none. The state of New Hampshire doesn't have any limits. The federal government has limits. They limit a home brewer to 200 gallons a year, which is not a whole ton, really. The reality is I've never heard of a single human being ever get in trouble for that. And really, they'd only count what you have on hand. So as long as you drink it as fast as you make it, you're pretty much good to go. So I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Neighbors don't tell on you.
Yeah, just don't keep like thousands of gallons around and be like, yeah, I'm just making this for myself. But I don't think anyone will hassle you, really. So there's no limits. Do whatever you want, basically.
Side job.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can always get yourself a nano brewer's license. I think it's $1,000 to the federal government and $250 to the state.
There was that big article in the paper recently about how craft brewing has become a really big thing in New Hampshire, and it's big in Vermont and Maine, but New Hampshire's catching up.
It's true. So in the late 80s, there were only about 30 breweries in the United States, and we're now over 4,000. Basically, what happened is when Prohibition hit, all but the very biggest brewers had to spend, I believe, 5-6 years not able to make product, so they all went out of business. But when they started back up again, only the big guys had money to get going and essentially were able to get themselves and create a market and a business model and laws that kept everyone else out. And it wasn't until the 80s where that started to change. So they had basically 40 years to run their business model the way they did, tie themselves to sports stars or this or that, which is kind of the way to go. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Awesome.